What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if you say you have faith, but do not have works? Can faith save you? If a brother or sister is naked and lacks daily food, and one of them says to you, "Go in peace, keep warm and eat your fill," and you do not supply their bodily needs, what is the good of that? So faith by itself, if it has no works, is dead. But someone will say, "You have faith and I have works. Show me your faith without works, and I by my works will show you my faith." This is the word of God for the people of God.
Good morning, Trinity. It has been a long time since I have been up here, so forgive me, I'm very nervous right now, even though I'm looking out and there's so many faces in this room that I know. I think that makes it harder. I feel like I'm being graded again when I was in seminary. I am very honored to have been asked to fill in this week as Pastor Tino is away, and we're going to be continuing our Rooted series. So I know that we have heard about, we are Methodists, we are rooted in grace, and Pastor Tino talked about the different kinds of grace. And then last week, he talked about the Methodist idea of holiness and how that was born out of the small group meetings that started when John and Charles Wesley were at Oxford. And now I am going to continue with talking about our Methodist roots in mercy and justice. And as I was thinking about what to say to this group, I feel like I'm preaching to the choir. This is Trinity. I feel like mercy and justice are baked into the DNA of this congregation. And I think the reason that Tino asked me to preach this particular week is because of the first time I met him for coffee. He was like, "Tell me about yourself, tell me about your story." So I told him about growing up Catholic and finding the Methodist Church in college. I joined a reconciling congregation in Oklahoma in the 90s, if you can believe there was such a thing. There was one. But I came to seminary not really knowing what I was going to do. I felt this call, but growing up Catholic, women didn't get calls. So this was a very new phenomenon for me. And I found the deaconess program while I was at St. Paul's School of Theology. So I am a deaconess. That is not an ordained position. I am not just a female deacon. Deacons are a whole other thing. It's the Methodist Church. We change terminology all the time. Things are confusing, and I'm sorry. But when I was telling Tino about what a deaconess does, I said, well, I like to think of it as this. My job is to comfort the disturbed and disturb the comfortable, which we can also think about. Thank you. I did not come up with that. We can also think about this as works of mercy and works of justice, right? You can feed a man to fish and he has food forever, but if he's hungry, he's not going to learn to fish very well. You have to give him a fish first and then teach him how to fish. Or there's the one that Nelson Mandela used about babies in the river, you can save the babies from the river, but if you don't find out how they're getting in, it's kind of pointless, you're just going to work yourselves to exhaustion. But we already know that. Trinity has been doing works of mercy and works of justice for decades, long before I set foot in this church in 2003. And me and my spouse came here because it was a reconciling congregation. Just that declaration is a work of justice and mercy for those of us who needed a safe place to go, that knew we weren't going to be welcome other places. We have a history of being welcoming to folks in mixed marriages during the civil rights era. We feed people lunch. We welcome them to our Thanksgiving dinner. We had AIDS teams in the 90s. We have Baby Grace now. We work with More Squared, Jobs with Justice, Casey Tenants. We made a marriage policy that got Fred Phelps and his clan out here to protest our church. If there is not a better message. But I don't know if those of you who were here then remember that marriage policy was not without some hard conversations internally in our own group. And a lot of people didn't want us to make that marriage policy. And it was a lot of the gay and lesbian and queer people who did not want us to make that marriage policy because they felt like they wanted their family and friends to be able to get married here and didn't want to see that taken away for their friends just because they were here. And the allies were like, no, this is what we need to do. If it's not all of us, it's going to be none of us. So I'm inviting you to kind of think back on that as I go forward with this sermon, because I think it's really easy for us to get complacent, for us to pat ourselves on the back for a job well done, and like, we're already doing this, so we don't really need to think about it, we don't need to talk about it. But that's not a very Wesleyan way to do things. John Wesley overthought and overtalked everything. But he also always came back to kind of check in and do some renewal for himself and for the movement and for the group. We need to be in touch with our roots and the reasons why we do the things that we do. So I'm going to step back and give you a little bit of historical context on John Wesley. I know for all of us in the St. Paul world, we like live, eat, sleep, breathe, die John Wesley all the time. But for those of you who did not grow up Methodist, and since I did not grow up Methodist, there was a lot I had to learn, and I'm just going to give you some historical context. John Wesley was in England. He was a British Anglican priest. His father had been a priest. His mother was a very spiritual woman and not a timid or one to hold herself back from speaking kind of woman. And he was alive from 1703 to 1791, so he had a good long life. But you'll recognize those dates of the 1700s, like this is around the time this land was being colonized with British people. And the British Empire was a vast thing that they were very proud of. Wesley came to the colonies. He met German Moravians on a mission trip to Georgia that greatly shaped his theology and how he saw theology playing out very practically in daily life. The Moravians were praying and singing on the boat as Wesley was fearing for his life that he was going to drown. I like to think of things, I'm not gonna be shy about this. I love to watch movies and read books, and I need like other pieces to kind of put things in historical context. So if you want to think about what the world of John Wesley was like, think about your Jane Austen novels and movies. The priests in those books, the churches in those stories are usually not very lively places, right? People are sitting there like trying to stay awake, fanning themselves with whatever they have. The priests kind of drone on and on. This is exactly what Wesley did not like about the Anglican Church. This is why he started the Methodist movement. He saw the need for spiritual renewal in the Anglican Church, which is why he and his brother and their colleagues at Oxford started doing those meetings in the first place. And if you'll remember when Tina was talking about these meetings last week, there were purposes to this meeting. It wasn't just to talk about theology and, wow, this church really sucks. What can we do to make it better? Like, they were very practical in their things. They prayed together, they sang together, they did discuss theology and what they could do to make things different, but they also went to the prisons. They went to the poorhouses. They talked to the people who were on death row and learned their stories and got to know their families and took care of their families as well as the people in jail. And they did that not because they were told by the Spirit that they should. There was no burning bush. It was a movement of that prevenient grace and that justifying grace within them that told them this is important. This is something we should do. I'm also going to point out, like a lot of us know the works of Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens was later than Wesley. Charles Dickens was writing about the poorhouses and the way we didn't really take care of our orphans and our widows in the 1800s after Wesley had died. So Wesley was kind of ahead of his time. There was no big social movement. There was no industrial revolution and social revolution that went with it yet. Wesley was including women in his groups, also ahead of his time, but you can thank his mom for that. So when I think about our Wesleyan and Methodist roots of justice and mercy, I kind of did a lot of reading of my old Wesley textbooks that I hadn't dug out in quite a while, and kind of came up with 3 key points that are really important for Wesley, and I think they're important for us today too. Number 1, works of mercy and justice are always rooted in the love of God and the love of neighbor. It's the work of grace. Now, if you know the story of the Reformation and Martin Luther in the 1500s tacked up his 95 Theses on the door of the Catholic Church because there was this huge debate. It has been a debate through centuries. We're probably not done with it yet. But what's most important? Is it to have faith or to do good works? And it was either or, either or. Paul wrote about it in his epistles. We see James writing about it again in today's epistle. Is it faith or is it works? What's most important? And for Wesley, it wasn't an either or. It was a both and. And I just saved you thousands of dollars. You don't need to go to seminary to learn both and, because that was the most important thing I learned in my seminary education. It's never either or. It's almost always both and, at least with God. So Wesley is kind of jumping on this train of both and when the groups started meeting at Oxford, these are Oxford students. They are not poor people. And when they gathered together, they kind of collected their money, they collected their possessions, and they gave it to the people that they knew that needed it. So when they were talking to the prisoners on death row, they hear that their family, they need money, like because that person's in death row, they don't have income coming in, so their wife and their kids need food and they need clothes. And the students would collect their money and collect their possessions, and they would give it to those folks. As the movement grew, they were attracting less affluent people and more blue-collar people. And I think this is a part where we can get really uncomfortable, because when I look around this room, and I mean, some of us are blue-collar, but not all of us. Some of us are fairly affluent. So how are we using the things that we have to make other people's lives better? What are the daily concerns of the people that we are in community with? And what are the daily concerns of the people that they love? Do we know? And are we using what we have to serve them the best that we can? Number 2 for Wesley, it's relational and communal. Again, this comes out of their circles. They're talking to the people that they know. When they meet, it's not just praying and singing, it's also conversation. What's going on in your life? What's weighing on you? We share joys and concerns. We pray for each other. But we also have practical things we can do for each other. Oh man, I'm really struggling financially. I'm not getting a pay raise, or I got sick and I had to take some time off of work, so I don't have income coming in, but I have rent that's due. And Wesley figured out ways to meet those needs because he knew about them, because he was having conversations and building relationships with these people. There's also a piece of accountability in these groups. You can't be afraid to ask hard questions and have uncomfortable conversations, like the one that we had when we set a marriage policy at this church. That was not an easy conversation to have, and I wasn't here at the time, but I can only imagine having the courage as a gay person to speak up and say, I don't want you to do this for me. I'm not asking you for this. I want my family and friends to be able to get married here. And who wants Fred Phelps outside their church? We didn't know that was going to happen, but what are the uncomfortable conversations we need to be having now? And I'm particularly going to invite you to think about this because as the Missouri Annual Conference, like all of the United Methodist churches that are in Missouri, we get together every year. Unfortunately, it's always on Pride weekend, so I'm never here for Pride. But as an annual conference, we've begun to ask some harder questions. Why is the United Methodist denomination very racially segregated? We have Black churches, we have white churches. We don't have a lot of churches that are a mixture of Black and white. And I look around this congregation, and it's more diverse now than it's ever been that I've been coming here. But have we really had those conversations as to why and what we might need to do differently so that everybody who walks in these doors feels seen, valued? The Missouri Annual Conference went so far as to put an unconscious bias class online that anybody in the entire conference can take for free. If you have not heard of unconscious bias, I invite you to come talk to me afterwards because I love talking about it. But it can't just be a conversation. It's also about self-awareness. This is the accountability piece, right? When we make decisions and we're making decisions that involve people that aren't in the room, whether they're gay, whether they're another race, whether they're another age, whether they're another economic demographic. We can't have those conversations without those people in the room, and making it safe enough for them to speak out and say what they truly think and believe. Because if they're too afraid to speak out, giving them a seat at the table doesn't do anything. And it also invites people in, which can be really hard when you're having these really uncomfortable conversations. But inviting people to participate rather than holding them off means that they're invested. It's their community too. You have buy-in. So when Wesley was talking to these poor families that were joining his communities, and they were telling him things like, we don't have clothes and we don't have money to buy clothes and we don't know what we're going to do. And women had knitting skills, but didn't have materials. He set up knitting circles. Do you know what happens when a bunch of people sit around knitting together? They talk. They build community. They build relationships. And there's the very practical work of making clothing that people need. So it was like everything all together in this beautiful way. The third point about Wesleyan roots in mercy and justice is that it's creative and it's flexible and it's smart enough to know when things need to change and to move on when something doesn't work anymore. Anybody who's read any Wesley knows he was not a good financial guy. Like, he was terrible with money. But it was also intentional that he was terrible with money. He has a quote that if he died with more than 10 pounds to his name, you could call him a thief and a robber, because that meant he wasn't doing what he set out to do, which was give all of his money back into the society so that it could go to the people who needed it. And if he kept more than what he needed for himself, he was doing it wrong. Probably not going to be 10 pounds this day and age, but you get the point. He set up a Methodist school to serve orphans, and it went great for a few years. He had money coming in to support all the students. They gave them food, they gave them clothing, they gave them books and classes. But the school didn't make it. After so many years, it had to shut down. The students were not learning the things they needed to learn. They didn't have the money coming in. He just kind of said, you know what, this isn't working anymore, and he dropped it. But then he came up with another thing to do. He set up a small business loan program, and I love this. People that are in the societies just need to donate a little bit, a penny, just 1 penny. But your penny and 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 your penny all come together, and now we have this little pot of money, and we can make short-term business loans so that this family over here can pay their rent, and this family over here can buy the goods that they need for their business, and they can pay it back in 3 months, and then we still have that little pot of money that we can divvy out to other people for small, short-term loans. Genius, right? Kiva didn't exist then, but Wesley was already doing it. That ability to think with people that don't think like you, that have different knowledge bases, that have different skills, different talents, and for us to all come together and talk about what can we do to actually help the people that we need with what we have. That's creative. It takes time. It's not easy. I also think this is where Methodist potlucks came from, because everybody can make their favorite dish, then you all come together and everybody feasts. But it's a good way to think about what we as Trinity might need to do instead of doing the same things that we've always done because we've done it for so long. And for so long doesn't necessarily mean we've done it forever. It might mean we've done it for 10 years, but it feels like we've always done it that way. But in reality, there is no we've always done it that way, because Methodism is always changing. So we need to ask ourselves some questions. What are our skills? What types of knowledge do we have in this room? And how can we come together to use them in fresh, new ways to meet the needs of the people that we're in relationship with? Who are we already working with, and how well do we really know them? What are the hard conversations, the uncomfortable conversations we need to be having? The aim of Wesley's social ethics, if you will, like this whole concept of renewal and mercy and justice, was not just the renewal of the individual or the renewal of the church, it was the renewal of society. That's pretty grandiose, but you think ripples on a pond, blah, blah, blah. I mean, you know these metaphors. But right now, Trinity is already having some of these conversations. We're already trying to think about who we want to become. We, as a United Methodist denomination, are definitely thinking about who we want to become. I'm going to talk a little bit about General Conference, and for all of you that do not understand or don't want to understand how the Methodist Church works, I'm sorry, but I'm a nerd like this, and I'm going there. General Conference is our legislative body. They meet every 4 years. They didn't get to meet in 2020 because of a certain pandemic, but in 2019, we had a special session that just talked about Methodist language around sexuality. Because since 1972, I think, which is before I was even born, we have been debating whether people that are lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, whatever label you want to put on it, what role they could play in our church. Yes, all people are of sacred worth, but then homosexuality was incompatible with Christian teaching. I don't want to feel incompatible. God doesn't say I'm incompatible. But we as a Methodist church could not agree. And so every 4 years, another fight resumed until 2019, where they said, we just want to talk about this one issue because then it doesn't get bogged down in all this other stuff. And the conservatives won, which I don't think many of us saw coming, but they won their way. The incompatibility language stuck. The bringing people up on charges for performing same-sex weddings stuck. All of it stuck. We're not ordaining gay people. We're not marrying people. And then, during the pandemic, all of those people that won that fight decided they were leaving the Methodist Church anyway, which I'm still not really sure why. It still boggles my mind. Like, you won, and then you're picking up your toys and leaving the sandbox anyway. Thanks. So at annual conference last year, so this is just Missouri, we voted as hundreds of congregations from across Missouri chose to disaffiliate. There is a process spelled out in our Book of Discipline, which is our rules and policies and procedures. And because 2020 General Conference didn't get to meet to talk about how legally the denomination was going to split, we kind of started the work at the local level and said, okay, there's already a process in here for disaffiliation. We'll let those local churches leave, and then we can figure out what to do. So that's kind of where we are in the middle of this messy process. But we had over 400 churches in Missouri alone, like congregations, voted to leave because we're getting too liberal. We're getting too progressive. We want to welcome too many people. And a friend of mine who is also like me, not ordained, but also seminary trained like me, preached on the floor of Missouri Annual Conference. And she used the metaphor of, we don't know what's happening. We don't know where we're going. It's like we're going to wander through the desert, which is a metaphor we are not unfamiliar with in the Christian tradition. But anytime we go on a road less traveled or through a wilderness, we're going to need things to get through that. We're going to need water. We're going to need an oasis to rest when we get tired. But there have been people in this denomination that have been cast out into the wilderness for decades. So they're out there, and they know where the water is, and they know where their oases are. And we can look to them to help lead the church in this new direction. My friends, we are one of those oases because we called ourselves reconciling when it wasn't cool. And so now it's time for us to lead. And I'm crying because when I heard this sermon, I felt like my friend was staring at me, saying, you know who you are. You've avoided leadership, and I have, for a multitude of reasons, safety being one of them. I am not ordained. I am not called to be ordained. And even if the church changes the rules, I'm not going to become ordained. My work is as a deaconess. My work is social justice. It's boots on the ground, working with people and building those relationships. But I'm also going to be the chair of the Mission, Service, and Justice Committee for this Missouri Annual Conference. And That means I'm going to have a quarterly meeting with the bishop and his cabinet. And I'm going to have to think long and hard about what I say and what I do in that room. But like me, this congregation has also been out in the wilderness, and we know where the water is, and we know things that the bigger church needs to know. Not that we know everything, because we don't. Not that we don't have to have our own hard conversations, because we do. But we can learn from other congregations, and other congregations can learn from us. I think for so long we have been hiding. We've been like crouched down in our little corner, like, I hope the bishop doesn't look too hard over here because we don't want to get in trouble. It's time to step out of the shadows, friends. It's time to have these conversations. The church needs us. We need each other. I need you. God's grace is always with us. God is always with us. And God always provides, what was Bob Hill's thing? A way out of no way. Like, we're in this muddled mess. But General Conference, I'm cautiously optimistic that they're doing their part. I think we're going to have a revised global social principles that takes out incompatibility language. I think we're going to have a regionalization plan that passes. It doesn't mean it's perfect, and it doesn't mean the work is done, because we as an annual conference can't ratify that constitutional amendment until 2025. But the work is beginning. The church is slowly steering their wheels off the well-trod gravel road. Are we going to be there to help lead them through the wilderness? And do we know the conversations we need to have with ourselves to do it well?